In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate two techniques that can be used to refine the transition from ribbing to stockinette fabric. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. I have a funny little swatch here that I've knit. It starts with ribbing, it switches to stockinette, and then I have an odd little row of knits and purls in the center, some more stockinette, and then I finish off with ribbing before I bind off. When you alternate columns of knits with columns of purls, as you do with ribbing, the knit stitches will come forward, but the purl columns will recede. And that's what you see happening here when we switched from stockinette to ribbing, is that once we switched, then we have the knit stitches are coming forward more than the flat surface of the knit right here, and then the purl columns are kind of hidden and they recede in the background. But if you look at the beginning of the swatch, where I started with the ribbing and then I switched to stockinette, it's a little bit different. You can see that this final row of ribbing, rather than those purls receding, they're sitting on top of the surface of the stockinette fabric. We can understand that by looking at this little funny row in the center of the swatch. So we have a field of stockinette stitches here, and in this one single row I alternated knit one with purl one, and you can see how these stitches, the purl bumps, are kind of coming forward on the surface of the fabric rather than lying flat, and certainly they aren't receding as would happen with ribbing. That is the nature of purl stitches on a background of stockinette. Rows of purl stitches that alternate with rows of knit stitches, you'll also get these raised ridges. That's what garter stitch fabric does. And so at this transition point from ribbing to stockinette, we get these purl bumps that lie on the surface of the fabric. So you may wonder, well, why isn't that happening at the other end? Well, the reason has to do with the structure of a knit stitch. If we look at this knit stitch right here, we see the V shape of the stitch. What we can't see is the head of the stitch. The head of the stitch lies underneath the surface here. When we work purl stitches, the head of that stitch, the very top of the stitch, is what lies on the surface of the fabric. So in this last row of ribbing where we're alternating between a knit stitch and a purl stitch, the purl bump is adjacent. It's right next to the base of the first stitch in stockinette. Where at this end of the fabric, the head of the stitch is further away because the base of the stitch right here is adjacent to the knit stitch below it. And so when we switch from stockinette to ribbing, we just don't have the same effect of the purl bumps lying on the surface of the fabric that we get when we switch from ribbing to stockinette. So there are a couple of different ways that we can refine our technique when we switch from ribbing to stockinette that helps to prevent this purl bump from lying above the surface of the stockinette stitch and causes these knit stitches next to them to come forward as they did when they were being worked in the ribbing pattern. So this is a swatch where I was simulating the heel flap of a sock a couple of weeks ago, and this swatch used a stitch pattern called heel stitch, where on the right side of the fabric, every other stitch alternated between a slip stitch and a regular knit stitch. And what happened was that the slip stitches come forward and the columns that are worked every row recede. So we can use this technique of alternating a slip stitch with a knit stitch when we transition from ribbing. So what I'm going to do is any stitch that's above a knit column, I'm going to slip it. Any stitch that's above a purl column, I'm going to knit it. And this is only for this first row where we're transitioning from ribbing to stockinette. So I'm slipping the yarns in back, I'm slipping as if to purl, and then it's a purl column here, so I'm going to knit it. I'm slipping the knit columns, I'm slipping the knits and knitting the purls, slipping the knits and knitting the purls all the way across. And from here on, I can just work in plain stockinette. So when I turn, I would just purl all the way across for this row. So what's happening here is that instead of this first row of knits kind of dipping down like that and allowing this purl bump to come up, the slip stitch sort of extends itself across the surface of that transition there, and it helps to maintain the appearance that this column is receding. It's a subtle difference, but it's a difference that is there. An alternative to slipping the stitches is to use a technique that is used in some versions of brioche stitch or fisherman's rib, which is to knit below. So any of the stitches that are above a knit column, we're going to knit into the stitch below the needle, and if it's a purl column, we're going to knit it. So an edge stitch, I'm going to just knit. And then we've got a purl stitch, so I'm going to knit it, and now I have a knit column. So I'm going to knit below. So I'm going to go right through the center of the stitch that's below the needle. I'm not going through the stitch that's sitting on the needle. I'm going below the needle. And I knit through the center of that stitch, and then I let that old stitch fall off the needle. And what happens is the heads of both stitches, the one that was below the needle and the one that was on the needle, are trapped and worked together. So it creates a double-headed stitch. Now I'm going to knit one, and again I'm going to purl right through the center, or knit right through the center, bring the yarn back through the center of that stitch below the needle, and then let that old stitch fall off the needle. We end up with a double-headed stitch. And we're going to knit, knit below, knit, knit below, knit. Knit below, knit. Okay, now this time we're going to compare the just switching from ribbing to stockinette, and over here we have the version where we have done a knit below in the first row of stockinette and up in the knit columns. So once again, we have that sort of stretching of this stitch in the knit column that helps create this continuation of the knit columns being above the surface of the fabric, rather than having it kind of dive down into the surface and allowing the purls to come above. So here we can do a side-by-side comparison of the two refinement techniques. This one on the left is when I slipped the stitches, and this one on the right is when I knit below. Several years ago, I had a knitting student at one of my clinics who wanted to re-knit the ragged cuffs of a machine knit Norwegian sweater she had purchased at a thrift store. When we removed the ribbed cuffs, I noticed that the transition between the ribbing and the stockinette fabric used the knit below technique. After examining other sweaters, I found that it was a fairly common technique used in commercial knitwear. Each of the two techniques I demonstrated today work equally well in Knit 1 Purl 1 fabric. But when working Knit 2 Purl 2 fabric, only the technique of slipping the knits and knitting the purls will work. Knitting below cannot be used in two sequential stitches. Knitting several small swatches is a useful way to determine which method of refining the transition you prefer. You may find you prefer the results of one over the other, or you may find one of the techniques just easier to work than the other. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.